But I'm here this evening because I'm the daughter of Oz Elliott, for whom the Osborn Elliott Prize for Excellence in Journalism on Asia Prize was named. Oz was a legendary journalist. He was editor of Newsweek magazine during its heyday, a champion of civic journalism during the civil rights era, the women's liberation movement, and the Watergate hearings. And he believed deeply that journalism is a higher calling. Oz was also passionate about the Asia Society, where he was a trustee. And so Richard Huylebroek, the American statesman and a family friend who was then chairman of Asia Society, decided together with Nick Platt, then president of the Asia Society, to create a prize in Oz's name for excellence in journalism in Asia. The winners of the prize over almost 2 decades are really, truly a who's who of some of the greatest journalists of our time, and no less so this year. The jury is delighted this year to present the award to 2 remarkable journalists, a reporter and a photographer, who covered the final days before the fall of Kabul. As the Taliban closed in, Matthieu Aikins and Jim Huylebroek, dogged freelancers with deep knowledge of Afghanistan, bravely rode their bicycles around Kabul, talking with high-level government officials, intellectuals, and other sources they'd cultivated for many years. In this penetrating New York Times Magazine piece with rich human stories, Aikins and Huylebroek documented the destruction of a liberal vision of Afghanistan, a vision that may never have reached beyond the compounds and cafes of Kabul, and the tremendous poignant loss for so many once hopeful Afghans. The piece reflects years spent learning the culture, the country, and the people of Afghanistan. And so on behalf of the Elliott family and the Asia Society, we are so delighted to be honoring Matthieu and Jim with this prize. And now I'd like to turn this program over to my great friend, Marcus Brauchley, former editor of the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and the founder of North Base Media. So over to you, Marcus.
Thank you, Dinda. Good evening, everyone, or morning, depending on where in the world you are. I'm delighted to join all of you in the Asia Society in welcoming everyone to this event. I'm especially pleased to welcome Matthieu and Jim, whom we'll join in a conversation in a minute. But first, I wanted to add a bit about the prize. As Dinda has said, the Oz Prize is named after one of the truly great figures in American journalism, her father, Osborn Elliott, who was, a charismatic leader of one of America's greatest magazines in its era, back when Newsweek magazine had its name gracing the pinnacle of a tower on Madison Avenue. He'd assembled some of the finest writers, correspondents, and photographers in the business. They brought intelligence, courage, and imagination to their work. And it's no surprise then that when Oz's friends decided to create this prize, they would also want to celebrate those traits in journalism. Unusually for journalism prizes awarded here in the US, this one draws entries from news outfits not only in the US, but also from global media companies and from journalists in the region itself. Over the years I've served on this jury, it's been noticeable how many more high quality entries we receive each year from journalists from Asia, not merely covering Asia. The entries we get paint a picture each year of the major events and themes across the region. For several years, we've had strong entries depicting the consequences of China's coercive treatment of minorities in Xinjiang and other regions. This year, we had a powerful entry on the sweeping political and economic policy changes afoot under President Xi Jinping, who I think may be the purest ideologue to lead modern China. There was some incredible reporting from Myanmar's harsh crackdown on protesters demanding a restoration of democracy there. From India, we had a project on how Prime Minister Modi's government uses technology to surveil domestic opponents and journalists. Amid rising talk of an economic decoupling between the US and China, we got strong entries from journalists who tackled the lively matters of semiconductor supply chains and the uneven application of economic sanctions, topics that that when I say they may sound dry, but trust me, are vitally important to understand the details. We have every year a great jury deciding this prize. This year's jury includes Barbara Demick, who's a journalist, author, and 2006 Osborn Elliott Prize winner. Obviously, Dinda. Nisid Hajari, who's an author and member of the Bloomberg editorial board. Zoraida Ibrahim, executive managing editor of the South China Morning Post. and Norm Pearlstein, longtime media executive advisor and former top editor of the Los Angeles Times, Time Inc., and the Wall Street Journal. So we're fortunate to have Matthieu and Jim with us tonight to talk about the extraordinary package they published in the New York Times Magazine last December on the fall of Kabul, and more about their experiences covering Afghanistan. They both lived in Kabul for years. They've learned languages, traveled widely, getting to know the culture, the people, and the place. Matthieu has written a book, which I have not read, but I just acquired, called The Naked Don't Fear the Water, which has received rave reviews for its tracing of a journey to Europe with Afghan refugees. Jim has published a book of photographs from Afghanistan in 2018. So thank you both for being with us here. I'm going to lead you in a conversation, and then we'll open it up to open up to the floor for questions, the virtual floor, after about 40 minutes. So let me just start rather prosaically and ask each of you to tell us a little bit about how you came to Afghanistan in the first place.
Matt, you're on mute, by the way,
Sorry about that. First of all, thank you for having us, and it's a tremendous honor. Wish we could be doing this in person, but times being what they are, we are doing virtually. So I came to Afghanistan in 2008. It was a trip that I'd started in Europe when I'd graduated college and kind of wanted to see the world, travel, try to be a writer. And I started in Europe, was sort of hitchhiking and couch surfing, and made my way to Central Asia with the ultimate intention of reaching India. And it would turn out to be a lot easier to get an Afghan visa than a Turkmen visa in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. So in the fall of 2008, I crossed the Amu Darya to Mazar-e Sharif in northern Afghanistan, started traveling the country, realized by a stroke of genetic luck, I looked Afghan, I passed for Afghan. I'm half Japanese, half European origin, but I was able to travel a little more adventurously in the country as a result. And I just got kind of pulled in. The country is obviously a place that has a strong attraction for, almost romantic one, for a lot of visitors. And perhaps that's what it was in the beginning. But, after a while, when you learn the language and you start to put down roots, then it becomes also the story of your friends that you're covering. So that's in essence how I got started.
For me, I was in college in photo school in 2014 with the intention of covering foreign assignments and or pipeline dream of covering foreign assignments related to conflict and like political importance. And I was about to graduate, and I was looking at what I was going to do, where I was going to go. And at the time, Syria and Iraq were in the news because of ISIS advancing and taking large swathes of the countries there. And I thought that might be a bit pushing it for risk, but also in terms of there was a lot of journalists that were there. While in Afghanistan, there was still the conflict, and there was still the US and international community heavily involved, but it was sort of pushed a bit to the background. So I thought if I would go there, I could try and find a foothold and shoot a portfolio and see where I end up. So I booked a ticket and went with my backpack for what I intended to be a couple of months, and then it ended up being many years so far. So yeah, that's how I got started.
Maybe I'll just add to that, Marcus. It's funny because I met Jim in 2016, not long after he had arrived, and obviously our stories are a little bit similar. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm a bit older, and I remember thinking at the time, here's this young freelancer who was staying with an Afghan friend and who's learning the language, and at the start of this adventure, and just thinking that kind of reminded me of myself and wondering where this adventure was going to take him. I was on my way out of the country at the time. I was doing this book, and then I didn't come back for a number of years. But it's funny because then when I did come back last summer, then fate sort of brought us together.
So I'm guessing a lot of people, even a lot of journalists, might not, choose to sort of meander across the border into Afghanistan because it was easier to get a visa than it was to somewhere else, or, decide to get on an airplane and just drop into a place that I think a lot of people perceive to just be a giant war zone. You did that. Then you also did something else, which I think is unusual among journalists. You both kind of immersed yourselves in the culture. And I think you both studied language. You lived outside of the compounds, I guess, and outside of the sort of the military sphere. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, journalists in general don't really, beyond embeds, don't really live in the military sphere. But it's one thing going to Afghanistan on assignment with a newspaper, and another going there at your own expense, and having to rely on yourself and the network that you sort of gather. But then, yeah, for me personally, I'd traveled around the world, always trying to sort of immerse and make sure that I'm like culturally appropriate. And usually the way that works is you try and learn the language, so you can communicate directly. And I thought me going to Afghanistan on my own, that would be important, that I spend time with the people there rather than solely in the expat community, as sometimes happens. And that eventually helped hugely in terms of being able to do work and to get around the country.
I think that when you're a freelancer and you can't rely on the support of an institution, or you're often paying your own expenses, then it really helps to have built the kind of infrastructure for yourself, to have learned the language so you don't have to be constantly hiring translators, to have a network of contacts, but also just a physical place to stay, to put down roots in a place. And that's what I did. And then I left. And when I came back last summer, again, I ended up moving in with Jim, who had a room in Kabul and in his house in Kabul. And he had built this whole, network of, he had people that he was working with, and a motorcycle, et cetera. And that's really essential to, I think, being able to spend the kind of time immersing yourself in deep projects. And it also became the infrastructure that we built on to kind of get through the dramatic events of last summer and the collapse.
Well, one of the things that really distinguished your package was how you went high and low. You described, for example, an incredible scene at the presidential palace where President Ghani was almost oblivious to the crisis, then suddenly gone. And the tale of a bureaucrat whose family had fled Kabul when she was a girl, and then was forced many years later to flee again, as much as her family had done. How did you sort of navigate that? So I understand, from what you said just a minute ago about, immersing yourself in the culture or learning language, you were able to, anchor yourselves more in non-official Afghanistan. But how did you do it on the other side of it? How do you navigate into the echelons society where you could know what's going on in the presidential palace as well?
Over the years, I had gotten to know a lot of people who then ascended into those ranks. So it was a very young administration, and a lot of the people that were just kids my age at parties in Kabul 10 years ago were now serving as senior aides or officials in the government. So it's partly a function of that, but the structure, the skeleton of the story is about the events that we witnessed or that other people witnessed, the actual lived experience. But once that was in place, I spent a long time trying to fill in the high level narratives, not just what was happening in the palace, but what was happening, for example, in Doha, meetings between U.S. officials and the Taliban. And that there was just a lot of legwork that I did in D.C. and New York. The thing was that most of the witnesses to this kind of high level stuff were actually outside of Afghanistan after they evacuated. So there was a whole kind of period where once I got out, and it was sort of, we had to wait a while to be able to just fly out normally again after the collapse. But once I got out, I tracked down a lot of those details and players.
How did, Matthieu, since you were there for a longer period of time, how did Kabul change over the years you were there? From when did you get there? The first 2000?
In 2008.
2008.
2008, it changed a lot. It grew. It was a boom town, and suffered from a lot of problems of uncontrolled urbanization, traffic, pollution, crime. But I think the part that I really observed as a foreign journalist, as an expat, was how the whole cadre of cohort of young Afghans had kind of emerged, who were more liberal, westernized. Maybe it's some of them had studied abroad, but they were people who had been born or grown up in Afghanistan. And they, instead of going to a party or some kind of event and just seeing other foreigners there, you saw a lot of Afghans who were now your peers. And so there was this kind of nascent Afghan element to that bubble world.
Did it feel to you that the obviously the package for which you won this award was about the collapse, the rapid collapse of the government and the whole structure that had been put into place? Did it feel to you at any point, or did the people who were living in that time expect that this was as vulnerable as it proved to be?
And I don't think there were many people who expected the collapse to come this quickly. To be honest, I did meet a couple in that period, in the last final months, who were warning that the end was nigh. But no, I think everyone, to varying degrees, suffered from a kind of collective delusion that was partly the product of propaganda and lies that were pumped out by our military, and which the Afghan government, learned from. There were PSYOPs departments that were funded by the foreign military at all the major Afghan security services. And as we know now, the US military was lying and manipulating statistics about the capabilities of Afghan forces. So there was a collective delusion, but there was also, I think, a propaganda machine that fed it.
Jim, did you perceive, how did you think about the stability of Afghanistan, the society there? And you obviously were traveling around the country doing your own journalism. How did you perceive it? Did you see it as inevitable that this would ultimately not succeed, the U.S. experiment in Afghanistan?
I think, that a lot of it was built on lies and deceit. But I do think that there was actually, in the last couple of years, sort of a more liberal urban society was taking foothold. And I do think that was real, that people were actually starting to express themselves and be more educated in the way that we may think about that. But then the countryside and also large parts of cities always remained very conservative and very traditional. And I think maybe not only us as Westerners, as expats, but also inside the Afghan government, I think there was maybe a lack of understanding of how deeply rooted those traditions and that conservatism was actually there. And I do think there was a lack of understanding of how Afghan society maybe was set up.
Maybe, Jim, I know we have a slideshow of some of your photographs, and maybe we could, if you wouldn't mind, just talk a little about sort of how you were trying to cover Afghanistan in the years you were there, what you were trying to capture, and how you saw your photography as a sort of tool for depicting Afghanistan beyond just Kabul. So if I don't know if the organizers can put up the slideshow now.
Yeah, I've always wanted to show a variety of angles, and not just the headlines, not just the fight and the politics, but also I mean, stories about well, daily life. And I mean, Afghanistan is such a rich, colorful country, both in diversity and in culture. And I've always wanted to approach it in a way that like I wanted to show all sides of it. Now this in particular is the US Embassy, or the outer wall of the US Embassy, the night that the Taliban took control of Kabul. And yeah, it shows exactly that, like girls' education, everything that the West sort of tried to push, and the Taliban was clearly not very pro. Yeah, I think.
Or bike ride?
This was yeah, the night that the Taliban had entered the city, and we had come home after seeing them enter and seeing them in the streets, and yeah, flocks of people basically come to cheer them on. Maybe not because of showing outright support, but people were confused and scared, and maybe like being out there in support might have helped settle them. But yeah, then at night we were like, okay, what are we gonna do? And yeah, we came to the idea of jumping on our bicycles and see what the situation was in the city and around the green zone particularly. And we found this eerie scene of empty streets where Taliban had taken the checkpoints, but there was very little activity at that time of the night. And yeah, going past the US Embassy was yeah, a very, very special sort of feeling. I think, yeah. So this is in May 2021, so a couple of months before the Taliban started taking control of provincial capitals. And I traveled down to Helmand with the Afghan military, province in the south, very volatile and sort of like always been the center of attention for the US military as well. And I was following sort of the fight to defend the last bastion of Afghan then government control, and how sort of the outer edges of the city of Lashkargah were under heavy pressure. And at night I went out with the military on sort of resupply missions, and then on the way back they made an unannounced stop at a military base, and all of a sudden all these soldiers are being brought on the helicopter, and it turns out that they were evacuating people, military on the periphery, to defend the center of the city. And yeah, the looks on their faces, they're all very young infantry, and yeah, the looks on their faces just showed that yeah, the end was near and everyone was tired. This is by Lake Karga in Kabul, on the edge of Kabul. So a couple of weeks after the Taliban takeover, and where it was sort of clear that, okay, this was the new reality, and the Taliban was going to amusement parks on Fridays to have a day off. And it was, yeah, really interesting to see how like the Taliban take a day off, and come nightfall, dusk, the sound of prayer starts, and everyone just dropped what they're doing and put their weapons on the ground and started evening prayers. And this is how that sort of frame come together. This jumps back to before the fall. This is in Kandahar, the largest city in the south of the country, a city where the Taliban had been doing a siege, really, encircling the city, and negotiations were going on in Doha, and the Taliban said, we won't enter the cities. But then in a few places that actually did happen. And so yeah, places with open space just became impromptu refugee camps. And the situation was very dire. There was no water, or very little water, and no sanitation, and no electricity in the heat of day. And yeah, the situation was just really, really dire. This is Kabul, and here we can yeah, definitely see the growth that Kabul has seen over the last 2 decades. I obviously wasn't there in 2001, but I imagine it was very different compared to what it now looks like. It's a mega city of 5-6 million people with big apartment blocks and wedding halls, and just a real bustling city. And yeah, it's my question, where is all of that going to go, and where will it end up in another 20 years time? This was the first, so yeah, Matt and I, we were there. We had decided to stay put and cover August 15th when the Taliban entered Kabul. A lot of people at that point were leaving. A lot of journalists were leaving as well, and we had decided we need to be here and be the eyes and witness this historic event where, after 20 years of U.S. involvement, the Taliban is rolling into Kabul. And it was afternoon, and the sun had started to go down, and we'd heard that the Taliban had entered from the west of the city, and we had made our way out there, and traffic has started to slow down, almost come to a full stop, and we continue partly on foot. And this is the first time we see a Taliban flag, or I see a Taliban flag out in the open in Kabul. And I got the feeling then, like, okay, this is it. This is actually happening. The event that I had not seen coming that fast is actually happening. And we're one of the few to actually document it. Yeah, I'll never forget it. Yeah, and then not too long after that, on the first Friday, a couple of colleagues and we head into town to photograph the first Friday prayers under the Taliban in Kabul. And we go to Pulakishti Mosque, which is a large mosque in the center of the city. And yeah, the Taliban is there in full force, and not the Taliban that you sort of have in your head, looking like, well, traditional Afghan dress and a Kalashnikov, and those are Taliban fighters. No, they're in full military gear. with night vision and the wraparound sunglasses, and it's just a very different sort of look to what you might expect. And yeah, we're there to photograph the Friday prayers, and all of a sudden a senior leader of the Haqqani network shows up and performs the sermon, and these were his bodyguards. So they were really sort of pushing the narrative of we are an organized army, an organized modern army. And then we go to to the very messy, very chaotic evacuations. This is early morning, and there was a few gates where the US and its allied militias were in charge of the gates and letting people in still. And on other gates, there was Taliban in control already. And this is one of the gates where sort of the US allied, CIA allied militias were still in charge, and just down the road were the Taliban. And so these two forces opposed to each other, all of a sudden seemingly at agreement, like, okay, we need to sort of let this happen. And they could see each other, and they've been fighting each other for years. And then all of a sudden, yeah, there's no more fighting. And yeah, that's an interesting feeling to see that all envelop. Yeah, that's one of the sort of more mind-blowing moments and experiences. This was an indoor garden of General Dostum, by then Marshal Dostum, which is a longtime warlord allied to all sorts of different groups and factions over the years. And he had built this incredible wealth, and this is his residence in Kabul. And this is these are Taliban fighters that have taken up that residence, and sort of those guys having spent 20 years outside of cities with very little luxuries and sometimes resources, coming into Kabul and seeing what that looked like. This is an extreme example, but yeah, I think they were probably as confused and astonished as we might have been by the sight of it. Yeah, a large part of the US sort of involvement in Afghanistan was road building, nation building. And this is the road leading from Kabul to Kandahar in the south, a road that has taken immense efforts, both financially and in human toll, to build. And it sort of became this cat and mouse game of building the road and then Taliban blowing the road back up. And I hadn't been able to travel very far on the road because of the risks and because of the lack of sort of control and safety on it. And after the Taliban came, the roads sort of were more accessible because violence had been subdued. And just being able to drive and to see what had happened there, where after every 100 meters, 150 meters, you had a big crater of an IED, an explosive device blowing up, and just the poverty around it, just to see how little of the financial sort of commitment that was made had actually reached the people living right next to it.
Thank you very much, Jim. That extraordinary photos and really a fascinating story. Matthieu, if Jim brought up something in that picture of Kabul and how developed it is and what a big metropolis it is, and the question of what now. When the Taliban reached Kabul and finally took over, there were a lot of theories. There were theories that they were going to return Afghanistan to what it was when they left, and there were theories that they'd spent enough time in hotel rooms in Doha and G5s at peace conferences that they understood the world and would modernize it, as we saw a picture of the military. What do you think? Where does it go? Well, first of all, at the beginning it seemed one way, and now there's some indications perhaps that wasn't the direction it's going. But I'm curious where you think it's going.
Well, I think given the shocking events of last summer and I think the deep misunderstanding about the Taliban that it revealed to us, or just how little we knew, it would be a bit unwise to make predictions. But the whole idea of the question of whether the Taliban have changed or not, I find a bit misleading. I mean, they have changed in some ways, just as the country's changed. But their ideology and they'll be the first to tell you that their ideas haven't changed. Their vision of themselves hasn't changed. But of course, that vision is implemented within a certain set of definite circumstances and environment. The Kabul that they've taken over is nothing like the Kabul of 2001, which was a half abandoned, half ruined city. It's a vibrant metropolis. It's far more diverse. The Taliban themselves are more diverse, and they have different trends within the movement. But I think, what we're seeing now happen around girls' schools, for example, this decision that was made to keep high school girls from class, not allowing them to return, which we expected to be reversed in the spring. And when it wasn't, I think it was a signal that the leadership is unchanged, and it's many of the same people who were in power in the 90s. Their vision hasn't changed. And we should also bear in mind that for the Taliban, I think the primary threat to their rule is internal, not external. There's no real viable opposition at the moment. And almost all the regional countries and major players are not interested in funding another round of civil war. They'd like to see stability in Afghanistan, and they're hoping the Taliban can deliver it. So the main threat to the Taliban is their own internal cohesion and the risk of a schism. So they're prizing right now consensus and unity. And unfortunately, I think that often means that the more hardline elements will prevail.
So you just talked about how little we understood the Taliban before they came back into power, and maybe still how little we understand them. One of the things journalists often do is we celebrate the general who comes up with the surge, and we give him all this credit for transformation. Not saying anybody in particular, but do we have any idea who is the architect of the Taliban strategy that took the country back in the short order in which the Taliban took it back?
Well, I don't think there is one personality who we could credit it to. There's some very important ones. One of them is Amir Khan Muttaqi, who's now the foreign minister, and I think it's very interesting to see he was one of the main players in the Doha negotiations with the U.S. And then once the negotiations with the U.S. were finished, and it was supposed to be inter-Afghan talks, he was switched to become he was already head of the Invitation and Guidance Committee, but he returned to Afghanistan via Pakistan and popped up in Afghanistan, sort of in the months leading up to the collapse, and was having these public meetings. And his job was basically to persuade people to switch sides and surrender. And he was the key element of that was this policy of general amnesty, the so-called afwa. And I think that was really a very critical element in triggering this kind of domino effect collapse. When people began to believe that actually the Taliban weren't going to take revenge and kill them, that if they surrendered, their lives and property would be spared. And that we saw that happening in the months leading up to the collapse, some very ugly massacres notwithstanding. But, when Kandahar fell and Herat fell to the Taliban, there weren't like massacres in the streets. And that was personally, I think, and I think Jim is on the same page here. That's one of the reasons we decided to stay, is because we saw how the Taliban's strategy had shifted, and we understood that they were trying to become the government now, and they weren't interested in killing foreign journalists, for one. So I do think that we, in the evacuation and the way that people felt such a dire necessity to leave, maybe represented a misunderstanding of the Taliban that was based partially on a propaganda of them being purely, mindless killers and terrorists.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting. Let me just, I see on the clock we should be opening up the floor to questions from the audience. I have one from email already. It says Afghanistan's a very fractured country, so it's likely the reactions to the collapse would vary. Did you find people who welcomed it? Could you talk a little bit about sort of the mixed reactions of people when the Taliban came into Kabul?
You want to answer that, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, whereas in Kabul itself, people were panicked. They were afraid not only by the Taliban itself, but how quickly they had come into town. But yeah, I think many people were not necessarily happy that the Taliban were back, but more so that the fighting had stopped, at least for the time being. People could sort of go about their lives again, even though, it's very different as before. There's a lot of things to worry about. Girls' education being one, women's liberties being another. But yeah, I think there's very divided opinions inside Afghanistan and outside too, about what this means and where this goes ultimately. But yeah, I think what I saw in the beginning was that there was a sense of relief, at least that people could go out into their fields and not being at risk of getting shot or airstriked or that. But yeah, I mean, there's obviously, there's division amongst all sorts of things in Afghanistan, and the Taliban is just one of it.
Do you both anticipate that the country will remain relatively under Taliban control? I know there are pockets of resistance, but is the Taliban organized bureaucratically to manage the country and to maintain security?
I don't think their bureaucratic organization is particularly effective. I mean, they're relying on the existing government infrastructure, all the mid-level and lower level civil servants, most of them didn't get out in the evacuation. They need salaries to survive. They've gone back to work under Taliban officials. But it's, I think that Afghanistan it's always had a fairly weak central state. That continues to be the case. It's more a question of whether there's going to be a challenge that, whether it's internal or external. Usually it's a combination of both, right? Whether an outside power is going to fund a rival in another round of the civil war. Until that happens, I see in the near term, the things being pretty stable. But again, it's really hard to make predictions about this sort of thing because we know so little about the internal dynamics of the movement. But as long as they stay cohesive, I don't see them being taken down by another challenger.
And they don't, unlike obviously the Ghani government, you had contacts, as you said, within the government, people who, for idealistic or other reasons, were part of the government. You don't have those same kind of relationships. That in the Taliban government, there's nobody you can talk to, and sort of, are foreign journalists able to get anything other than sort of carefully crafted or not crafted, but limited information from the Taliban?
I mean, I just spent the last month talking to people in the Taliban government, and it's definitely a new and tense relationship. But they're people too, and you can build relationships with them, and people will begin to trust you a little bit, or at least trust your intentions. And I had a lot of very illuminating conversations off the record with Taliban officials. Yeah. It takes time and work, and I think we're just beginning to do that.
And are you planning, I should have asked this a long time ago, are you both planning to continue working there?
I definitely will continue working there, whether it is full-time or on and off is a question that I haven't answered or been able to answer yet. But it's also, I think, a question of, will foreign journalists be, will they keep on being allowed to work there? Because I mean, the Taliban have been welcoming to foreign journalists from the start. That seems to sort of have started to become a bit more of a difficult relationship. But I think, if anything, Matt and I, given that we sort of know our way around a little bit, and there's definitely many others that do too, I certainly hope that we will continue to work there. And it's early days. I mean, the Taliban has been in charge for about 10 months now, and it's very early days to be making predictions and look into the future and everything. But yeah, I intend to keep on going there at least and work there. We both spent a lot of our careers so far there, and I know I can speak for both of us, like, we love the country and its people as well. So yeah, that's definitely my intention.
Question we got on email, Jim, is whether you ran into trouble ever with the Taliban, since in an earlier iteration they apparently didn't especially love individual photography and imagery.
For performing my work, doing my work, I haven't had any problems in terms of photography is forbidden and that kind of stuff. Photography has always been a sort of difficult thing to do in Afghanistan because of conservative values, and photographing women is a very sensitive topic there as well. But I mean, there was a lot of chaos. There was a lot of panic especially in the beginning, like finding the right way to behave with especially the younger sort of foot soldiers of the Taliban. That was an interesting sort of learning stage, both for us and for them. But yeah, I don't really have many complaints about that, because I know it's all new for everyone. And it's sort of like, figuring out what works, what doesn't work.
I think we should also point out this situation is completely different for Afghan reporters who've been intimidated, harassed, jailed by the Taliban, and there's been a really unacceptable double standard. Unfortunately, we've seen just a lot of problems with freedom of the press for Afghans, and Westerners have a very privileged position right now in the country, which I think we should use to report.
There's a question, Matthieu, who came from email. What was the immediate reaction toward the U.S. After the fall of Kabul? I guess the one way of asking is, was there a sense of betrayal? What do liberal urban elites, such as they were, think about what how the U.S. managed it, and what do you think the outlook is for how people in Afghanistan perceive the West and perceive the U.S. now?
Well, I think people in Afghanistan feel a great sense of betrayal and abandonment by the U.S. and still hope, are still dependent. I mean, the country is being kept on life support by billions of dollars in humanitarian aid, which the U.S. is the largest donor to. So there's still this entanglement and dependency between the two countries. But I do think that people in the U.S., most of them would like to forget about Afghanistan, have forgotten about Afghanistan. That probably includes the current administration, which has, I think, been happy to turn to conflict with Russia. And paradoxically, that's actually probably been for the best, because there aren't a lot of good options right now in terms of U.S. foreign policy toward Afghanistan. And I think if there was more attention, there might be more pressure for revenge, for sanctions, the kind of thing that won't really change the Taliban's behavior, but will lead to more suffering for the Afghan people.
Another question from email: do you see a generational difference within the Taliban, within Afghanistan in general? I mean, are there younger versus older divisions?
Definitely. And I think that there's a whole generation of young Talibs who've grown up in cities, who are educated. Some of them studied abroad. But I don't know if, there's also a lot of most of the suicide bombers were young too. So there is a generational difference in it, but it's not always, going to be in a certain way, mean they're more liberal or open-minded. There is a new generation of Taliban for sure.
Can you talk just a little bit about that new generation of Taliban? Like, what from the people you might be speaking to, and who are those younger Taliban? How would you describe differences between how they think and see the world and how their elders do?
I mean, they've grown up in a world that is connected, and they have access to so much more information about what's happening, just like the rest of their Afghan peers. And so they're aware of other countries, and they're more literate. They are, I think, probably more tolerant of diversity. When
you say diversity, what do you mean by diversity?
Look, the Taliban of the 90s, they came from rural villages, mostly in southern Afghanistan, a very specific, very conservative culture. They didn't have access to television. They weren't literate. Mostly had the radio. This is a generalization. And that was, again, true for a lot of the country. But Afghanistan has changed so much in the last 20 years. There's been this huge development that's obviously taken a big step back, but it's also, I think, irreversible. And I do think the Taliban have been affected by those trends. They are part of the society, especially now that they've come back in and are ruling it. And so if there is a reason for hope, or just an expectation of some kind of progress, some kind of change, rather than a return to the grim situation of the 90s, it is in the fact that Afghanistan has changed, has become connected to the world. And the Taliban are aware of that. But like the US, it's a bunch of old guys who are making the decisions, which is, we've been in a lot of countries. So the mullahs in Kandahar are not reflective of that change in diversity. But again, it's not just the Taliban that have that problem.
Yeah, nobody has anything on the US when it comes to gerontocracy. One question from email. about how you guys work together. Matthieu references Jim several times in his stories. Curious to know how you work together, how the reporting developed, how you shared material. If you could talk about your relationship a bit.
Yeah, so as Matthieu said a bit earlier, we've known each other for a long time, and then sort of fate made for us to be in the same house when everything started crumbling quite rapidly. And I think for us both to be there gave us both a bit of reassurance that, okay, we can weather this sort of storm, because we both know our way around, and it's not our first sort of rodeo in Afghanistan. That definitely gave me the confidence to stick it out. And then, I mean, we did a lot together. We also went out on our own, but then it was sort of the chain of events that that brought us. I mean, we did work for the New York Times paper together, and then we did this for the magazine also together. I think it's very helpful to work as a team rather than individuals in situations where there's many unknowns.
Like Jim said, while we were working on the story, we were also basically covering for the New York Times, as an institution. We were the only people they had on the ground. They'd evacuated everyone else. Another friend of ours, Victor Blue, came on soon afterward. And so the three of us were the New York Times in Afghanistan, doing the daily coverage, of course, with the support and cooperation of their whole team and everyone, but they didn't have anyone else in the country. We also found some new local reporters to work with us. So we had our own little bureau, and we were extremely busy while all of this was going on. And I think the story and that we came up with is a reflection of those very unique circumstances. And I'm sure I would have stayed, and I'm sure I would have done a story about it. But it wouldn't have been the story if it wasn't for the fact that I moved into Jim's spare room, a few months before the collapse, having been away from Afghanistan for a few years and wanting to come back and write something.
That's a great story. And the package you wrote is a fantastic package. And I encourage everybody who's listening who hasn't seen it to go on the New York Times website, dig it out. It is a brilliant depiction of how the last days and then the last days of the old regime and the first days of the new regime took place in Afghanistan. It's insightful, it's original, and the sort of the on the ground feel, your abilities as reporters who are able to really connect with local people is so visible and so important. And I guess I encourage everybody to go and buy your books as well, since we're having that kind of promotional part of the conversation. I want to thank you both for spending an hour with us, and congratulate you again for the prize, and thank the Asia Society for hosting us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's been a real honor to be the recipients of this award, and to be with you today as well.
Thank you.